On this day, in 1920, 27-year-old returned serviceman John Hallinan Dalton was laid to rest in the Drayton and Toowoomba Cemetery. Having earned respect amongst his peers while serving in World War I, many ex-servicemen attended the funeral, acted as pallbearers, and marched to the cemetery in the cortege. However, whilst a bystander might have suspected that young Dalton died as a result of old war wounds, they would have been mistaken. In his early years, Dalton had completed a one-year apprenticeship with Toowoomba's Rosenstengel and Clymer as an upholsterer before gaining a much coveted position with the railway department. Despite the importance of his employment, and just prior to the disaster that would become Gallipoli's August offensive in 1915, duty beckoned and John enlisted on the 14th of July as one of the 11th reinforcements to the 2nd Light Horse Regiment. Surviving multiple maladies during his 3 years of deployment throughout Egypt, Dalton was finally returned to Australia in April 1919, still suffering from the effects of malaria. Despite his continued symptoms, Dalton was welcomed back by the railway department and was soon back on the trains plying their trade between Toowoomba and Brisbane. Early on the morning of the 20th of March, Dalton had been working as a fireman, a coal stoker in railway terminology, on an Ipswich-bound steam train loaded with sheep, a route he'd travelled numerous times before. As the train made its way between Woolston, current-day Wacol, and Goodna, Dalton climbed up on the coal tender towards the back of the engine in order to tend to an issue he'd obviously seen earlier. Looking towards the back of the train, he'd clearly forgotten the train would soon be passing beneath an overpass locally dubbed the 13-Mile Bridge, as it travelled along an area of the line then known as Dingo Hill. As the train sped through the cutting, as engines were prone to do on this particular section of line, the driver turned around just in time to witness Dalton crashing backwards onto the tender. He'd failed to duck beneath the rapidly approaching footbridge, and the top of his body and head had slammed into the structure with the full force of the train's forward momentum. Fighting back the shock of seeing one of his work colleagues so horribly injured, the train driver, W. Allen, immediately hit the brakes. However, the train continued its journey for a further 180 feet, almost 60 metres, before it could be brought to a complete stop. The final jolt as the train came to rest flung Dalton's lifeless body from the tender and onto the side of the tracks, where the remaining train crew immediately disembarked and ran to his aid. Unfortunately, there was little anyone could do. Dalton had suffered a fracture to the base of his skull as a result of the impact, and had no doubt been killed instantly. His lifeless body was placed back on the train and conveyed through to Goodna, where the local police were notified before Dalton was transferred back to his hometown of Toowoomba. Ironically, for the authorities and locals of the area alike, Dalton's horrible early morning accident brought back memories of another fatal incident 7 years earlier, at the exact same location and as a result of the exact same footbridge. On the fateful night of the 7th of June 1913, the last passenger train from Brisbane to Ipswich came rattling down the line past Woolston in the direction of Goodna. Incredibly, and quite coincidentally, a young male passenger also by the name of John, who, like Dalton, was also a railway department employee, a telegraph operator, and amazingly also a resident of Toowoomba, was returning home from the pictures via the 11:15 p.m. service. As the train accelerated towards Dingo Hill, reaching speeds exceeding 40 kilometres per hour, an unusual sound reverberated through the carriage. Curiosity prevailing, John opened the window and leant out into the darkness in an effort to investigate the origin of the noise, just as the train thundered beneath the 13-mile bridge. Noticing his fellow traveller had been leaning precariously through the carriage window for an unusual amount of time, Somerset Wilson approached John from behind and tapped him on the leg, with no response. Grabbing the young man by the clothing and pulling him back through the window, Wilson recoiled. Out there, in the darkness, John's head had made contact with a steel brace on the bridge pylon as the train passed, inflicting terrible injuries to the right side of his head. Unconscious and bleeding profusely, a mad dash ensued through the adjoining carriages as the train pulled into Goodna Station. By sheer fortune, Dr. McElroy from the Goodna Mental Hospital had just alighted and was called back to render whatever medical aid he could administer. Despite Dr. McElroy's best efforts, the inevitable had only been postponed, and young John Mustard passed away a couple of hours later after being transferred to the Ipswich General Hospital.